Good evening, everyone. Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 7 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Andrew de Block, coming to you live from Johannesburg. And unfortunately, it's my last time doing so, but I won't spend too much time on that right now. But I'll move on with the rest of the presentation. We do have, of course, over 150 episodes recorded and available on YouTube. So if you miss out because of load shedding or any other reason, you can never fear, you can always catch up on our YouTube channel. So tonight we have a panel of BirdLife South Africa speakers who are going to tell us some more about one of South Africa's most threatened and rare birds. So as I mentioned, this is unfortunately my last webinar as a host, and I'm going to hand over to my co-host, Christina, to spend some time. I'm not sure what she has prepared, but I'm going to turn off my camera.
Yeah, so tonight we're saying farewell to Andrew as a co-host. He will be leaving BirdLife at the end of the month. For those who don't know, he is standing for election as a Member of Parliament for the Democratic Alliance in about a month's time at the national elections. So we had a lovely but very emotional farewell for him at our recent staff meeting. So I won't say too much now and make the works flow again. And you can move on to the next slide, please. He has had a very varied career at BirdLife. He started out in the seabird conservation program as a penguinologist, and then he migrated to Joburg to take up the position of the AV tourism project manager. And I must say he has excelled in this role, from the community bird guide training courses to starting the amazing Go Birding web page, which I hope everyone is using. He's also presented at the Travel and Tourism Expo, hosted a press roadshow in the garden route, and received the runner-up place in the tourism, leisure, and hospitality category of the Rising Star Awards. So he's managed to do a lot in a comparatively short space of time. But of course, many of you know him as the co-host of Conservation Conversations. He has co-hosted officially since 2021, but I think he stood in a few times for Melissa during 2020. And he's also been a very prolific presenter as well, filling in some gaps when we've had presenters pull out at the last minute. So I just wanted to say to Andrew, you have been an amazing teammate on the Conservation Conversations team. And on behalf of the rest of the team, we wanted to thank you for all your hard work and all the time that you've put in. So you've presented or hosted 48 episodes, which is about 31% of the total, which is quite a significant amount. And if you turn that into, well, look at the time that's been, if you listen to all the episodes that Andrew hosted, that would be 2 days and 9 hours and some odd minutes and seconds. So that's a very significant contribution to what is an amazing webinar series, if I do say so myself. So yeah, thank you very much. It's been amazing. You're such an eloquent speaker, and it always seems to come very naturally to you. And if I am half the host that you are, I would be very proud. So there's one more slide from the team at BirdLife South Africa. This is taken from our recent staff meeting. We've said a lot more, but yeah, just thank you from the staff at BirdLife South Africa, many of whom you've hosted on this show. And then just one final slide from me. So Andrew will be joining the DA, and we hope that we know that he will continue to advocate for the environment. And it's been said that maybe there's an environmental ministership in his future. And so I just wanted to throw back to this 2019, I think it was, Ecologic Awards celebration, where we had to dress up as your outdoor hobby. And so this is Andrew meeting the current minister, Barbara Creecy, with a Secretary Bird stuck on his head. So hopefully that's a sign of things to come. And yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. You will be greatly missed.
Thank you, Christina. I've managed to avoid the waterworks this time around. I wasn't so lucky at the recent staff meeting, but it's been very special to be involved in this webinar series. And I think a lot needs to be owed and recognized from Melissa Whitecross's perspective, putting this all together and giving us the platform. But it has really been a privilege to host some of the most fantastic speakers over the years and also have such a wonderful audience. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you for supporting us as the Conservation Conversations team. I hope that you'll continue supporting the webinars and also supporting BirdLife South Africa, and no more so needed than for the Botha'sLark. So I'm going to use that as a segue to avoid myself talking too much and rather let these wonderful people talk. So on to tonight's actual webinar. We have a panel of 3 people. Hanneline Smit-Robinson, or I should say Dr. Hanneline Smit-Robinson, needs no introduction to this audience. She's presented a number of times before. She is our head of conservation at BirdLife South Africa, a wonderful contributor to conservation in South Africa throughout her tenure at BirdLife South Africa. She oversees all of our programs, of which there are 7 now, and does an incredible amount of work behind the scenes to make our conservation work. Then we have Dr. David Ehlers Smith, who doesn't have quite the same tenure as Hanneline. He's joined us very recently as our Science and Spatial Planning Project Manager, but has a no less impressive CV, having worked in some fascinating places across the world. Dave brings an incredible amount of expertise and a lot of smarts to the organization, it must be said. And he's really thrown himself into this Botha'sLark work, and you'll see why it's just so urgent and why David has just really prioritized this moving forward. But it's been great to have some overlap with David in my last few weeks and months at BirdLife South Africa, and I must say I've been incredibly impressed, and I'm sure you will all be equally impressed after tonight. And then last but certainly not least, Robin Colyn, who was with BirdLife South Africa until a couple of years ago. He has since emigrated to Canada, where he's working as a consultant. But Robin is also at the moment completing his PhD, some of which is focused on the Botha'sLark and some of the ecological monitoring and conservation planning that is going on for the species. So all 3 of these people are some of the cleverest I know, and some of the most hardworking. And those 2 attributes are going to be key if we're going to turn around the situation for the Botha'sLark. So with no further delays from my side, I'm going to ask Dave to turn his video on and unmute himself and kick off the presentation on everyone's behalf. Thanks, Dave.
Sanbonani, Moloeni, Koyanant. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Andrew. I'm now going to start the presentation. And please, Andrew, if I can just get a thumbs up that you can see my screen.
Looks great, Dave.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so looking at this title slide, I think we can all agree that it's not the most charismatic of bird species, nor is it even easy to identify. More on that later. But I hope tonight's presentation will convince you that the conservation of Botha'sLark is the most pressing and critical issue currently facing all of South Africa's terrestrial avifauna. Before I begin, I must highlight and acknowledge the hard work and input of the Botha'sLark Specialist Working Group, and in particular BirdLife's Ernst Retief and Alan Lee. And we're also obviously delighted that Robin could join us all the way from Canada to explain his impeccable research that actually allows us to tell this story. So for some background, Botha'sLark requires heavily grazed, high-altitude grasslands associated with dark clay soils, specifically where cattle have recently been present. It's a very specialized, very range-restricted species, and it requires heavy grazing pressure to keep the grass short. And it looks like, rather than fire resulting in the short grass, it's the grazing pressure that seems to be this important component. However, it may preferentially nest in burnt areas. As a Spizochorus lark, it's likely insectivorous and granivorous, but the diet is poorly quantified and may be one of the limiting factors in its distribution. It is a ground nesting species and dependent on surface water, and it drinks regularly, particularly during the winter time. In the 1983 assessment, it was estimated that there were about 20,000 individuals. By 2015, the ESCOM Red Data Book of Birds estimated that the population had dropped to below 2,500. So we have a multitude of threats. I'm sure everybody that tunes into anything conservation-wise is very familiar with the loss of natural habitat. In this case, it's primarily due to conversion of grassland and pasture and the shift towards monoculture, particularly for things like croplands. It's also would appear to have lost its symbiotic relationship with the great migration of large ungulates that would have occurred across the high altitude grassland complex. This is an ecological condition that is no longer present, as the ungulate population is largely confined to enclosed protected areas, and grasslands become increasingly fragmented and reduced in area. Climate change is another threat. The reduce in rainfall in these mesite grasslands, increasing the temperatures as well, and likely creating ecological constraints. So there's less time for foraging, more time is required to drink, and there's more pressure on being able to find enough forage for nestlings and offspring. With fragmentation as well comes predation of eggs and nestlings. This disrupts the natural predator-prey relationship and also can introduce novel predators that are able to exploit the eggs and the nestlings. So just in case you don't know what a monoculture looks like, this is a very typical landscape you'll see, particularly around the high altitude areas of South Africa, a maize monoculture on the left or a soil monoculture on the right. And increasingly, we're looking at wind infrastructure as a problem. So there's a proliferation of wind farm applications, particularly in the area with which it overlaps. And the impact of wind turbines and next generation turbines is uncertain. Botha'sLark don't have a display flight, however, it is a nomadic species, so we can't outlaw the potential for collision. And just to give you some context here, your regular wind turbine has a hub of 100 meters, the blade length is 60 meters, and the rotor sweep is 11,300 meters square. Now, next generation turbines that they're working on now is going to have a hub of 130 meters. The blade length is going to go up to 100 meters, and the rotor sweep is going to amount to about 31,400 square meters. So obviously anything flying within the range of these turbines is likely to have some kind of collision, impact, or conflict. There's also a tricky conversation to be had around the disturbance of nesting sites by aviatourists, as unfortunately everybody's clamoring to get a site of the species before it goes extinct. But the greatest threat to the species is a lack of political and economic will to safeguard the Botha'sLark. We've got a real dearth of available funds to adequately address and mitigate these threats. So we do have gaps in our scientific knowledge, despite all of our best efforts. We do need to increase surveys across seasons and within habitat patches in areas that we've not been able to reach for various reasons, such as landowner tenureship, that kind of thing, to ensure that we're not actually overlooking the species, either temporally or spatially. We need to understand a little bit more about the impact of climate change in terms of both the species' ability to track its niche as it shifts under climate change conditions, and also as it has to drink more frequently, take shade more frequently, spend less of its time foraging, performing these kind of behaviors. We need to know a little bit more about the extent of nest predation and disturbance by human activities, as I mentioned, particularly around aviatourists and also invasive species. And this is also important given the potential for leveraging funds from tourists to go towards the conservation of Botha'sLark. Grassland conditions for breeding and microhabitats, we're starting to get a little bit of a handle on this, but we could still definitely improve on our knowledge here. And as I mentioned, the clarity on the impact of wind energy infrastructure is critical given the large overlap in the distribution and all the areas that are being prospected for development. And Robin can contest to this as well. The similarity of Botha'sLark and RebCap calls is creating potential for misidentifications where we're looking at records only on audio. So given the scope of the problem, we're basically at the stage now where we are having to vet every potential sighting or every potential record with a photograph, because we've both discovered that the red-capped lark mimics the Botha'sLark absolutely perfectly. So this is an example of the Botha'sLark habitat. It's short grazed grassland, dark soils, high altitude, high rainfall, with these bare patches of soil around. And this is actually a photograph taken from the last known breeding site that we are aware of. So with that background covered, I'm going to hand over to Robin, where he can actually get into the nuts and bolts and all of the information that's actually allowed us to get to this point. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Dave. So I'll be presenting a small component of work. Dave was very generous there, but a small component of work that forms part of my PhD that was initiated during my tenure with BirdLife in 2000. Well, the work started in 2016, so it's quite a long-standing segment of field work that was done between 2016 and 2019. And then initiated as a PhD a couple of years later. My PhD title is Larking About, Predicting the Ranges and Population Sizes of Larks across an heredity gradient in South Africa. But we'll obviously be zoning in on the Mesic Highland grasslands, where I studied these three focal species over here: Botha'sLark, RudsLark, and yellow-breasted pipit. Just to mention, my supervisor is Peter Ryan, and I'm doing this through the Percy Fitzpatrick Institute. David, we can move on. If we zoom into the actual results at hand here, this chapter really wanted to assess essentially some knowledge gaps. We wanted to assess the distribution, population status, and habitat requirements of these three endemic highland species. Although we know a fair amount of each of these species, there are still huge knowledge gaps, as Dave pointed out. And then to zoom into the first aim of the chapter, which was starting from where are they in the landscape? And if we really want to get a handle of how these species are doing, the first port of call is to understand where they are. And so I implemented a species distribution modeling approach, and obviously collected and collated all available historical accounts of where, in this case, Botha'sLark occurred. I used the species distribution modeling workflow, which then harnessed all of this available data, historical occurrence records, to then understand what does this distribution look like, and what are the prevalent constraints of the distribution? What is shaping the distribution from a climatic perspective, from a topographical perspective, as well as from a broader habitat perspective, to hopefully provide some insight in terms of the size of the distribution. Are there any areas where the species could occur that maybe just has poor coverage right now, and so forth. And so jumping into those results without going too far down into the methods, if we look at what that might look like, Dave, on the next slide. So looking at a typical distribution modeling approach, this is an example of all the SAST data that we have for the three species on the left, as well as a particular distribution modeling output, in this case for RudsLark, on the right. So using this methodology, we were able to set up certain focal study areas where we wanted to then delve further from a survey perspective. And so really assessing the distribution using these distribution models allowed me to then set up a framework for where to target surveys on the ground to then do further studies for these species, because they are obviously, as I think all of you know on the call, they are low density species, enigmatic, very difficult to detect. So if you just randomly go into the landscape to try and look for them, you'll have a pretty hard time in terms of getting any sort of detections often, or at least more often than not. And so these study sites span from the far north of the Mesic Highland range up in Dullstroom, which is study block A, and then went all the way through the Amersfoort-Armelo region, which is study block F. Excuse the chronological order, they were added in to fill more gaps as I conducted more and more surveys. And then we go into the core of the Botha'sLark range, which is really survey block B, which is that Wakkerstroom, Dullstroom area, and then down into study block C, which is the Eastern Free State. So this encompasses Meermal all the way down to Harrismith. And so if we then kind of zoom into, well, what does the distribution model look like just for Botha'sLark? This is what it looks like. And if we just zoom in onto the areas that have known current or historical presence records, Dave, if you can go one slide on, it really is that area over there. The areas to the north and south, although they are all peripheral predicted areas, we have known occurrence records for those areas. And so really this should constitute the core range, which really spans from kind of southern Abraloa, northern Amersfoort area, through the Wackerstrom, Dachauerkraal area, and then around through the Volksrust area into the Harry Smith down in the far south. And so looking at some of the constraints of the distribution, it's a myriad of rainfall and temperature variables. Really, the species is wedged into a very small climatic niche that's largely driven by the quantity of summer rainfall and certain metrics of aridity, which immediately in my mind sparks some concern from a climate change perspective. It seems like there are thresholds there that could be tipped pretty easily going forward. If anyone is wondering about the stark kind of boundary of the range, almost following the provincial boundary over there, the dotted lines, that is there's a continental shelf where elevation dips off quite drastically, up to about 500 meters. And so the climatic niche changes drastically as you go off that continental shelf. And so going forward, if we think about some of the impacts and constraints that climate could have on the species, Dave, if you can jump one slide on. Some of it might be cut out there, which I apologize on, but if we do some climate change projections using global climate change models, what we see is a contraction, a north-south contraction, which is the two red arrows on the north and the south, and a eastward contraction, pushing in from the west there, which is basically pushing the range up northwards into that core red area. Those straight red lines are topographical or not climatic barriers where we perceive that the distribution won't shift into because it's markedly different to where the species currently occurs. And so really what you can see is that the species climatic niche is essentially being sandwiched, and it hasn't got much space to move or shift or expand into going forward potentially. What does that mean from a kind of a stats perspective in terms of what are we talking about numbers wise? If you look at the chart here, what we're zooming into is Botha'sLark specifically, which is the green. Just over the past 30 years, and then going forward, you can see significant projected declines of up to 70–80% in the climatic envelope for the species, just based on this effect that I try to articulate now. If we go forward, okay, so what does that mean? Once we now have these survey plots and we delved a bit deeper into the distribution and actually went out and did a whole bunch of surveys. Essentially, I conducted 250 walk transects, each spanning about 1 kilometer on average. So it would equal 248 kilometers walked within these areas where one would expect to encounter these species. So targeted walks, set out in a stratified grid within these study blocks. And the aim was really to determine which characteristics were most important for microhabitat suitability. What does the species need to occur on the ground? And then using this transect data, can we produce density estimates for these species to understand what is their projected current density or population size, and what does that then mean from a conservation perspective? Each of the transects included vegetation sampling. So I went out and per transect, we sampled every 250 meters for composition, structure, and then biomass and cover samples were taken, one sample per transect. That's actually where we clipped biomass and dried it out and weighed it. And then we did some percentage cover analysis. And we then used a regression tree approach to assess the association between where we had species occurring, or in this case, where Botha'sLark occurred versus not, and a set of predictive variables that speak to these microhabitats around grass structure and composition. Because species response is not static in terms of scale, I included scale optimization. What that really means is that I assessed variables on different scales because some species need larger patches to persist. It's no point you have a 1 hectare patch of grassland, the species might just not be able to persist. There's this aspect of scale optimization which needs to be accounted for. Jumping into the results, without hopping further on the methods, we're going to be zooming in onto the central panel over here, which is Botha'sLark, Rudd'sLark, and yellow-breasted form part of the study, but we're not going to touch on that now. What came out of the transect data was essentially that the species needs, as listed number 1 there, the strongest driver, large tracts of grassland area, a 1 kilometer spatial scale, so they need fairly large intact areas of grassland. And the converse of that basically says that as these grassland areas become more fragmented through various other land use types, this is going to have a negative impact on the species from a habitat suitability or occurrence perspective. Some of the more micro-habitat level factors coming through, which is that 0 kilometer, so the local spatial scale, like very much on the transect, was the presence of dung, i.e. the recent presence of grazers was a very strong predictor of occurrence, as well as lower biomass, lower overall ground grass biomass. And so areas that were more senescent, fallow or moribund had a much lower probability of occurrence. And then interestingly enough, areas that had lower fire prevalence overall. So areas that were annually burnt in conjunction with some of those other variables were less probable to host the species. I mean, these grasslands are a fire-driven ecosystem. They need fire, but fire prevalence in terms of annual burning definitely came through as a negative for all 3 species, but in this case specifically for Bothas as well. If we then take this analysis, this transect data analysis a bit further and start speaking to that third aim of the chapter, which is, well, you know, what does this potentially mean for the species from a density estimation perspective? I conducted distance sampling, taking the 250 transects, presence absence transects with, you know, the associated metadata collected on those transects, and then produced abundance estimates. And very sobering picture, but the abundance estimate for Botha'sLark came in at 340 birds. And please remember, this is the global population. The entire species range is that area displayed. So the current estimate suggests that there can possibly be only about 300 birds left in its range, given our encounter rates and associated data. Also, to further just emphasize this, is that on the 250 transects, I had a 5% naive encounter rate. Only 5% of all transects yielded a sighting of Botha'sLark, which further kind of paints the picture. Out of those 250 transects, we were recording them across a startlingly small number of transects, and very many other areas that had the species historically all came up empty in terms of just not, you know, not encountering the birds in these areas. And just to further drive home the impact here is not just the species struggling, Rudd's lark above there, also projected 51% declines in using the current density estimate compared to previous density estimates. If we take this a step further, although that is sobering enough, but if we really want to understand, you know, well, can we delve a bit further into the habitat side of things to understand how the habitat has changed and maybe try deconstruct some of the elements that might be causing these reductions. We delved further into, as a combined initiative, myself and David and Alan, etc., delved into dynamic habitat indices. But essentially, it's a satellite imagery-based index that can be calibrated to capture certain states and productivity of underlying habitat. And essentially what we're looking at here, without getting too technical, is on the left, this is based on a body of peer-reviewed literature. We've just taken it and scaled it, calibrated it for Mesic highland grasslands. And so when we bring this home to a local level, i.e. if we think Wakkerstroom or Daggarskraal, on the right here, this is what the DHI index, the dynamic habitat index, looks like on the y-axis. And on the x-axis over here, we have grazing intensity, which is derived from the vegetation plots from the PhD data. And what you can see is the DHI index is actually able to pick up on the response or on changes in underlying grassland structure based on what's been happening from a grazing perspective. You can see undergrazing on the far left comes in the middle of the DHI range. The areas that are rotationally grazed, rested, i.e. what I would say is more ideal grasslands, start increasing in the higher end of the range, and then severely overgrazed sites coming way lower down. And so this is really encouraging, because what it shows is that this DHI index, which is a real-time satellite imagery-based index, is able to pick up on differences in grassland structure on the ground. And this led us to believe that maybe we should investigate this further to see if this could be used to assess habitat suitability for Botha'sLark across its range. And I'm pleased to announce, I guess, or to inform you that the results are very encouraging thus far in terms of its ability to track changes on the ground for Botha'sLark. However, once again, the results from this particular study are again quite sobering. If we look at the northern part of the species range, which in this case is study block F, and look at that associated results, which would be the next and study block F here for those who bird for the species or have birded for Botha'sLark in the area in the past, or just know these areas. Study block F corresponds roughly to the Aramolo area and then down to the Amersfoort area. So it's really that kind of complex over there. And if we look at the results from this particular area, Amersfoort to Aramolo, which would be the next slide, Dave. What we can see here is we have the DHI index, which is that remote sensing index that I displayed 2 slides back on the y-axis, and we have year on the x-axis. And what you can see is that the areas that have not had presence, i.e. that Botha'sLark have been absent from for more than 5 years, is the red line, are coming in way lower down from a DHI value compared to the sites that yielded presence in the PhD transects, which is the blue line in this particular case. The yellow line that sits below the blue line are areas that have yielded presence records in the past 5 years from other ornithologists or birders in the area, but were not recorded on my transects that I conducted, but both of them coming in quite high. So this is encouraging already in itself, showing that this index is able to at least display that the sites where the species is absent in this region does indeed have a much lower level, a DHI level, a productivity level compared to the areas where we were getting the species. If we move further south in its range to see how this index holds up, and now we're moving to the core part of the range that most of you will be familiar with when you think of Botha'sLark. This is Daggaskraal and Wakkerstroom, but also extending westwards to Volksdrift, Steelsdrift. If we look at the results coming out of that DHI analysis, the same kind of trend. The dark red, almost brown line at the very bottom is Daggaskraal. The areas of Daggas that yielded absence that I sampled coming in very low. Same for the red line for the Steelsdrift Volksdrift area, some historical sites there that yielded no presence coming in lower. And then the 2 blue lines are areas that yielded presence and coming in a bit higher. Obviously, the lighter blue line Steelsdrift's got a bit of a wavy shape to it, and probably showing some variation across the years, possibly based due to either one or a combination of rainfall and management. If we move on to further south in the range, and this is really the Eastern Free State area, the Meermill complex, which is up in the north, and then down into the Harry Smith area, which used to yield the species quite frequently. At one quite popular birding spot, at least historically, was the Botha'sLark Triangle near Harry Smith there, which some of you might recall. If we look at those results, showing an even more stark picture, that Harry Smith Botha'sLark Triangle sites, as well as some of the very southern Meermill sites coming up very low from a DHI perspective. And once again, the sites that yielded presence, the blue line, coming in quite a bit higher. So in a nutshell, the DHI index is really showing a strong, or it's really showing some ability in differentiating the sites where the species is absent compared to those where the species has been reported. If we bring this all home and have a look at the entire range for the species by grouping all these sites together, we get a pretty clear picture from an habitat quality perspective. If we move on to the next slide, you'll see that sites where we have very recent confirmation of presence, the yellow line, and or those sites that were have confirmed presence through the PhD transects are coming in at around 3.4 or higher DHI value, productivity value, whereas those sites that are absent are clearly coming up lower. And so what this suggests is that it could suggest that these sites where the species is absent, these sites still have grasslands, but that the quality of those grasslands have changed to a point that possibly could mean that it's no longer suitable for these species and might be therefore a contributing factor to why Botha'sLark are absent from these sites. If we map this spatially, because now that we have a metric or a handle, a tool that can characterize habitat quality for the species, we can map that. And in this case, we've mapped out two spatial snapshots, 2003 and 2023, so 20-year time span difference. And what the blue represents are areas that were suitable, i.e. habitat that was suitable for Botha'sLark, both in 2003 and 2023, whilst the red represents those areas that were suitable in 2003 that are no longer suitable. And I guess the take home here that is really just the quantity of red. How much habitat is still grassland, but is no longer suitable for Botha'sLark. And the biggest concentrations of red in this particular picture are unfortunately around the Dachauerkraal area, which is a core area for the species and should be of major concern, as well as the Amersfoort area further north there, and then down in the Eastern Free State around the Harrismith area, huge contractions in suitable habitat, constituting about a 30% reduction in habitat availability for the species. If we just bring this home, so what have we learned from all these transects? Botha'sLark really favor open, short to low cover grasslands, as well as short to high cover grasslands. This is kind of typical of the Dachauerkraal Wackerstroom area. But importantly, on the next slide, Dave, is that, there we go, that they also do seem to need some heterogeneity in grassland structure, i.e. some taller tufts that are scattered across that broader management unit. If you recall, grassland availability on a 1 kilometer spatial scale was important. And this heterogeneous structure could be important for nest building, for just concealing themselves from predation in the evenings, or even just, climate refugia during the hottest parts of the day or during very warm periods, i.e. heat waves, etc. And going on, Dave, what this really means is that we should not be managing for one type of grass structure. We should be managing for heterogeneous grass structure. This is the example of 2 or 3 management units on a particular farm that hosted all 3 species and had a wide array of grass structure, from that open low cover grasslands to the short high cover grasslands, as well as some taller components scattered throughout. And this allows or gives these species a buffer in case one management unit burns or is not grazed, is rested, etc. It pads them and buffers them based on changes in rainfall and so forth. And this, I believe, is really important and is going to be a key conservation initiative that is going to need to be driven from a habitat management perspective. Is aiming for heterogeneous grass structure. If we go on, Dave, next slide, please. And so really to bring it home, we need to be managing grasslands for heterogeneous grass structure with grazing as the primary method of defoliation. Currently, in many areas, fire is the primary method of defoliation in terms of what's removing biomass. And we need to shift towards healthy, rotational grazing regimes that rest fallow in between periods of high intensity grazing or moderate grazing, whatever the case may be. But grazing needs to be a feature that is interspersed with periods of rest. And this would allow heterogeneous grass structure that not only benefits Bothas, but also benefits these other 2 species, and particularly rights that are also mentioned is also highly threatened and seems to be decreasing along a similar line. Move to the next slide. I'll just be touching quickly on some of the work emanating out of the work led by Alan Lee, the Science Innovation Program Manager with BirdLife South Africa, and some of the Red List work that he's been undertaking with his team. On the very far right, the chart is a population projection. And if you look at that linear projection, which uses all the available SABAP data and all the sophisticated modeling and science that Alan is leading, it displays that the species could go extinct if we use the linear model as soon as next year. So once again, just to drive home the plight of the species, this really is an urgent issue that requires drastic conservation attention. And if we tie that in with a population estimate of 300 birds, 340 individuals to be exact, from the PhD work presented now, as well as that 29% reduction in suitable habitat, it really paints the picture and urges an uplisting of Botha'sLark to critically endangered from endangered using criterion A2 of the IUCN's Red List assessment. And once again, for those who like visuals, this kind of just paints the same picture, which really shows you population size on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. We had that regional assessment pre-1990, which estimated a population size of 20,000 birds, the blue bar. We then go to Barnes 2000, the orange bar, which estimated a population size of 5,000. We then yielded an estimate of 2,500 using the 2015 Red Data Book, and we're now looking at a population estimate of 340 birds. And I think this just paints the picture of the plight that the species is currently facing. And last chart that is once again also from the red listing work and other science that Alan Lee is doing. This chart essentially shows reductions in reporting rate on the y-axis, so that's percentage reporting rate change, and reductions in range change between the two sub-atlas periods on the x-axis. And what we see is I want you to zoom into Botha'sLark there, which is in the very far left-hand bottom corner, which is the worst place to be if you're a species, because that means that you've undergone pretty large reductions in both reporting rate and range change. And that's just, once again, another data point to paint the same picture of the plight of the species, and that they are potentially very much facing a really high risk of extinction in the short term. And extent of occurrence, similar kind of picture, the two species with the smallest extent of occurrence, which is essentially the distribution that encompasses all the presence records that we have for the species, is Rudd's-Lark and Botha'sLark, really showing that their range is that small, highly constrained, and any cumulative impacts you overlay onto that small constrained range just increases the vulnerability and susceptibility of the species to local extinctions, and hopefully not, but even global ones. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Hanneline, who will talk about, well, what now? Where to from here? Hanneline, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin. And thank you, Dave, for the introduction. And yeah, thank you, Robin, who is no longer really part of the BirdLife South Africa team. But if it wasn't for Robin's PhD work, the surveys and the scientific analysis, we would have been very much unaware of the current plight of the species. And I think you'll agree with me that we all feel the absolute urgency and the graveness of the situation. So in parallel to these scientific analysis and the surveys that Robin's been doing, we've also been implementing environmental education and awareness project at Dagga. And this work was started in 2023 and implemented by Christy Garland, BirdLife South Africa's Wakkerstroom Center Manager. And she's assisted by an intern who actually lives in Dagga, Palesa Molloy. Thanks, Dave. So the work at Dagga, and this is just a few photographs of the landscape at Dagga, and as you've learned from Robin's presentation, this is one of these historic sites. And probably many of you on this webinar tonight would have actually been able to say that you've been to Dagga, one of the BirdLife South Africa bird guides, and this is where you've ticked your Botha'sLark sighting. So sadly, for the last few years, there's no longer Botha'sLarks at the site, and few pictures here show the site. And apart from what we do in terms of the Botha'sLark conservation work, we also work with the schools in terms of other environmental problems. So raising that sensitivity, looking at erosion problems, river pollution, etc. And at this stage, I'd also like to recognize the Eatstein Family Trust in terms of the contribution and making it possible, this environmental and education and awareness project at Dagga. So we work with both a secondary school as well as a primary school. And you can see there the number of learners. So more than 2,000 learners that's currently benefiting from this environmental education project. Thanks, Dave. We've started off by doing audits, as working specifically with the educators or the teachers, as well as with the learners, to understand what was their baseline understanding, especially in terms of the environmental education work, not only Botha'sLark. And then Christy moved into educator workshops. So this is not only focused, as I've mentioned, on Botha'sLark, but also on other species and other environmental problems. And here we've got a few photographs which you've got permission to show also from the learner workshops. And then recently, Christy undertook a holiday program. This was now in March 2024. So 3 days of being outdoors with these wonderful kids and learning and exploring their immediate environment. So I think it's nice to know that apart from this graveness that I've described, there's also this positive work that we're doing with the community at Dagga. So I've seen a question already in the chat earlier. What now? Where to? What's the next steps? And that's really what I'd like to cover in the next few slides in our presentation. And our proposal is really to get someone into place as soon as possible. So it should have happened yesterday, but to get a Wackerstroom project manager or a Botha'sLark Fellow of Conservation employed in the area, focusing on the core range of the species and being based at the Wackerstroom Centre. So the main role of that person would be to focus on the habitat conservation of the species. So that would entail working with the landowners, so engaging with the landowners throughout the distribution of the species, also engaging with the landowners to understand, support, and to champion sustainable land use practices that will allow for both economic and ecological viability. And then also engage with these landowners to maintain habitat management, particularly the grazing regimes. So Robin described just how important it is in terms of the habitat and the grazing, just how that grazing intensity is absolutely critical for Botha'sLark. And then to work with the landowners who's already showed willingness in that core area to declare another protected environment. So working through biodiversity stewardship with these landowners, and the actual protected environment will be called the Highveld protected environment. And then also to promote awareness, not only with the landowners, but really with all other stakeholders. So these stakeholders include also communities living within the distribution of the species. So the area that we're talking about here specifically, if we look at the maps, is really all within the grasslands IBA, so important bird and biodiversity area. This will soon, hopefully later this year, become a KBA, key biodiversity area. This is South Africa's largest important bird and biodiversity area, and incredibly important from a conservation point of view. So within this grassland IBA, there's a number of protected areas, such as the Snowberg protected environment, Mabola protected environment, Komman-Klimpasi protected environment, and Pongola Bush Nature Reserve. And then, as I've already mentioned, the Highveld protected environment will also be included in this area. And it's important to note that not only Botha'sLark will benefit from our conservation efforts, but also other species such as rutslark and yellow-breasted pipit. So you would have seen the science and the analysis and results also for those two species on some of Robin's slides. And we're working quite closely with the Mpumalanga Parks and Tourism Agency in terms of this work, and once declared, importantly, will provide post-proclamation support and also work on further protected area expansion. This larger landscape is also a strategic water source area, so it is an incredibly important landscape to be working in, and there will be benefit not only to other species, but also to other biodiversity and also in terms of ecosystem services. And following on from that, there's a whole suite of other species that will be safeguarded, and these are mostly threatened and endemic grassland species. So just to mention a few, there are 21 threatened species that will benefit from our conservation work in the area in this high altitude grassland complex. But to mention a few, the endangered and endemic rutslark, endangered secretary bird, vulnerable and endemic yellow-breasted pipit, vulnerable African grass owl, endemic blue korhaan, all our crane species, and so the list continues. So once we have a Botha'sLark Fellow of Conservation or Wackerstroom project manager in place, we can also look at more detailed scientific studies and also importantly monitoring and surveys on the ground, all those areas where we overlap with the distribution of the species. So point counts can be implemented as well as line transect surveys. We can also implement camera trap surveys across the distribution, especially at artificial water bodies. So outside the breeding season, these birds seem to come together at artificial water bodies. That was where I was fortunate enough to see my last sighting of Botha'sLarks. And also Dave actually mentioned the potential problem with the red-capped larks also responding to the Botha'sLark call. So audio moths being deployed at the same time at these localities to record the call of the species. And then very importantly, to develop a species action plan for the species. This should happen quite urgently, so over the next year or two, to coordinate all our conservation efforts, hopefully, to have a positive impact, and then through this implementation to measure and to monitor our success. So if we are lucky enough to actually find more of these birds through our surveys, so Robin mentioned that he found only birds on about 5% of his surveys, we can then move on to also implementing more science and research, and that is ad hoc camera trap work at identified nesting sites. Nest predation may be a problem. These birds may be sensitive to disturbance as well, so we could possibly try to quantify that. And then I mentioned also earlier about the threats in terms of potential risk by wind energy infrastructure, whether there could be collision risk. So we could do ecological work to understand Botha'sLark flight behavior, and then also analyze the risk of climate change. And the climate envelope was actually shown by Robin, just how important it is and how the species distribution is actually getting smaller. But apart from that, there could also be a change in Botha'sLark behavior, specifically breeding behavior that's linked to climate change. So urgent next steps. To summarize these steps, we'd really like to have a Wakkerstroom project manager or Botha'sLark fellow conservation in place, and hopefully by mid-year to start our work to ensure that we can start to engage with the landowners and that we can start to do more surveys. Camera trap and the survey work will then follow on from that. There is a potential risk because we have so few areas that we can actually take birders to see the species, that there could be a risk through AV tourism. Hence, we want to develop a code of conduct for bird guides and birders, and this will also be done in the next month or two in terms of the viewing of the species. Then Alan Lee and his team will be uplisting the species to critically endangered later this year. Then from that, we'll have a species action plan to coordinate our conservation efforts. We'll develop habitat management guidelines that will be implemented across the distribution of the species, and the protected environment will hopefully be declared in the next year or two. So where we are, and Dave mentioned it at the beginning, is that we cannot do this work without funding. So we need some tools, and the tools is to have someone in place, and we need funding for that person, and we need a vehicle for that position, and then some equipment, camera traps and audio mouse, etc. And we want to continue our Dagga environmental education and awareness good work. So at this stage, a big shout out to some of our existing donors. The funding from these donors are absolutely catalytic in helping us to mobilize these urgent conservation actions. So big thank you to Birding Ecotours that provided the first funding and have just committed substantial amount of more funding towards this project. The Eastdown Family Trust for the education work, Rolof Botha and Dominique Botha, who have both contributed. And as you can see, we're targeting the Botha families. So if you're Botha and you're online tonight, we're targeting you too. We're appealing to everyone to help us to absolutely get this process in place as quick as possible. And this is our call to action. So help us to save Southern Africa's most threatened species, and perhaps these species on the African continent that's closest to extinction. Yeah, it's incredibly upsetting just to think about this. And we've got our scan QR code there, and also how and where you can donate. But there's various ways in which you can become part of the project and really just help us to promote the plight of the species as well. And at this stage, I'd like to thank everybody that's been incredible and been involved in the project up to now. The photograph there was taken last week. That's the BirdLife South Africa, Botha'sLark team. But a big shout out and thank you to Robin for his research and the conservation work that he's doing. And especially also all the advice and the guidance that we receive from the Botha'sLark Specialist Working Group, which is made up not only of BirdLife South Africa, but a number of private consultants, individuals, especially also universities and also the Endangered Wildlife Trust. So we are grateful for all your support. And thank you, everyone, for listening tonight. And if you have seen Botha'sLark recently, please do email David and please let us know sighting coordinates. We'd really appreciate that information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanneline and team. Dave, I'm actually going to ask you if you can just share that screen again and put the call to action slide up. I think if we can just leave that up for a minute or two to give people a chance to scan that QR code, that would be great. Yeah, thank you for the work that the team has done. It's incredible to see how much work has gone into this, but of course we're only in the starting blocks now in terms of being able to reverse that situation. And Hanneline, you mentioned it there. This is probably one of, if not the most threatened species on the continent of Africa, and at this point the most likely to go extinct. And that'll be the first ever bird species in modern history, at least, to go extinct on the continent of Africa. There have been some on the islands, famous examples, the dodo, but on the mainland of Africa, there hasn't been a bird extinction, and we don't want that blight on our name as South Africa. BirdLife South Africa is a very small organization, admittedly punching a lot above their weight, but here's an opportunity to empower us to really make a difference and turn the situation around before it's too late. There's very little political will, unfortunately, from those who have the authorities and powers to, well, and the real mandate to protect these birds. So unfortunately, it's left to organizations like BirdLife South Africa to step in and fill the gap. And hopefully it's not too late for us to turn this around, but we've got a crack team of people on it. We just need the funds and capacity to make it work. So please, if you can contribute, if you know someone who runs a car dealership and can give us a vehicle, if you know someone who has a surname Botha and doesn't want their legacy to go extinct with this bird, if you have some spare change that you can throw at this, or perhaps you have a company who might like to put their name behind a research fellow or a conservation fellow for the Botha'sLark, that would be amazing. And I think just talking to the room, I think we're all pretty much birders in the room. Some of us are more obsessive than others, but there is a lot of pressure on this bird at the moment. There's not many left. Robin told us there's about 300 left in the world, and they're found in a very small area. A lot of it's on private property, so the sites that are known are very few. And there was an incident that they didn't talk about it in their presentation, but I'm going to. I don't know if I'm allowed to, but there was an incident where there was a known nest, and it's the only nest that we've known of in the last breeding season. And there was a lot of pressure put on one of the local bird guides to show people this bird. And this nest was active, and there was pressure from tourists getting a bit too close and disturbing the breeding. And eventually that nest was abandoned, and now we're not sure if those birds will come back to that site. And to think that those offspring of that bird might have contributed to the population recovery is a very tragic thought. And we are also losing out in terms of the important and urgent research that we can do on these birds' breeding and habitat preferences. So please, if you're a birder, watch out for this code of conduct that's going to come out specific to the Botha'sLark. I also do remind you that the BirdLife South Africa Birders Code of Ethics already mentions avoiding disturbing breeding and sensitive and threatened species. So those people who did go and put pressure on this bird and put pressure on this guide to show them the site already were in contravention of the Birders Code of Ethics. But I think it's important now that we put something specific and bespoke out for the Botha'sLark, because it isn't such a terrible, terrible way. So not to end on a dreary note, I just want to thank everyone for the incredible presentations and the good work that they do. We do have opportunities for questions now. So if you do have a question, just pop it in the Q&A box. And if you're watching us on Facebook, I'm also watching the comments section there. So do feel free to pop it in there. So I'm going to point some questions now at various ones of our presenters. Hanneline, I'm going to start with you. There's a question here from Shashi. Shashi has just mentioned that they've heard about the color painting of wind farm blades. So obviously wind farms are a potential threat. I know you've been keeping abreast of our birds and renewable energy team and the work that they've been doing on colouring blade tips at wind farms red. Can you maybe just share with us some of the update there?
Thanks, yeah. Thanks, Sashi. That's one of the new projects that we're actually running in collaboration also with the South African Wind Energy Association. We've got permission from the civil, from the Flight Association. Sorry, I can't think of the avian. Well, help me, someone in the chat, in terms of the permission that we required, but we can now paint the blades in different colors. So the color that was chosen was actually red, so white and red blades. This is currently being trialed. It's been shown to be successful elsewhere in the world, especially in Norway at the smaller wind farm. It hasn't been used that widely internationally, so South Africa is leading again, and we're quite excited to test this and to look at the results that we'll receive from these trials.
Awesome, thanks. Dave, perhaps you can field a query from Monica, just asking about whether it's possible to raise these birds in captivity as a conservation action.
Yeah, this is something that we've been discussing a little bit in the background. It's when we're dealing with such low populations, and as we mentioned, we only knew of one nesting site. To take eggs out of nests when the population is so small is obviously a huge ethical conundrum. Then you've got to successfully raise them, rear them when the diet is not 100% known, and then it's obviously the ethical conundrum as well of releasing these birds into a landscape that's not actually protected yet, or it's not secured yet. So to release birds into an area where potentially they are not going to thrive because clearly the population itself isn't thriving. So it's in the back of our minds. There's a lot of research to be done. I'm not sure whether raising larks has ever been done across the world, but I know it's been successful in primates, but obviously there's a lot of different physiological and ecological constraints there. So it's definitely something we're considering, and it's a very good question, and we'll keep it 100% in mind. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Dave. Robin, I'm going to bring you in here. There's a couple of questions from Rob Simmons, who you, I'm sure, will know very well. He's asking about some of your DHI data variation. Just asking if the variation you show in the DHI for Bothas is a reflection of rainfall, perhaps, which was generally lower in the 2013 to 2018 era. And then a follow-on from that, what's the critical factor in the ecology of the Botha'sLark? Is it insects or seeds associated with ungulate dung, perhaps?
100%, yeah. So as far as the variation, that first question, Rob, yeah, that would be a response if it's across all the sites, which it was in those 2 or 3 years. In my mind, that can only be related to productivity and a driver productivity on a landscape level, which would be rainfall driven. So drier years versus wetter years on average. Whereas the site-based, like the inter-site variation, on a very local level, that would be driven by grazing and fire, the two disturbance regimes that are present. So, and as for the second question, in terms of like diet related, I think there's still a lot we can learn, but my observations, and like I said, I mean, I only encountered them on about 5% of my transects, but I had some time spent with the species, which was great in the field, and really observed them feeding off both. As far as I could tell, but I think further diet studies definitely would do the species, or do us a lot of well in terms of insights. But a lot of time spent foraging in those open, low cover areas, particularly around areas where hay is dropped off as supplementary feed in winter. You often get them feeding around that, which makes me think seed that's messed from those feeding areas. And then also have had birds feeding around the actual areas where dung is deposited. Now, is that once again just seed deposition, or is that insects? I can't be sure, but as far as we can tell from previous studies and literature and field observations, it's probably a combination of both.
Thanks, Robin. And there's a follow-up question from Rob, just asking whether or not there might be space for a dedicated MSc or PhD student to look at the ecology of the species alongside the project manager position Hanneline talked about.
Hanneline, do you want to weigh in there? I mean, from my side, I think anything more we can learn about the species is only going to be a win. There are obviously challenges that Hanneline listed in terms of gaining enough data to constitute or to make up a postgraduate study. Like, are we able to record enough data? But I think in some areas, particularly when we start harnessing things like camera traps and acoustics, one can start building up pretty big data sets pretty quickly. And I think, if anything, we need extra information right now to conserve the species. So my vote would be absolutely, without a doubt. Hanneline, I don't know if anything else.
Oh, absolutely. I think funding is just a limitation. I know that there's actually a lot of interest from the University of KwaZulu-Natal to help with habitat studies, also from Derek Engelbrecht and Limpopo to assist with more work. So yeah, the more we could get done, the better, I think, in terms of our understanding of the species and potentially being able to still make a difference in time.
Hanneline, I'm going to stick with you. There's a comment and then a question here from Brent Coverdale, who's obviously a good friend of ours and does a lot of work with EKZN Wildlife. Brent is just remarking how tragic it is that there's so many species now that need our help, but that also need funding, and thinking of the likes of blue swallows, vultures, and now Botha'sLark as well. How do we as a conservation community, when we're competing for these same resources, how do we prioritize which species we work on, and how do we make sure we're not parasitizing each other's funding streams?
Sure, Brent, could you have asked me a more difficult question? Extremely difficult one. I think in terms of prioritization, a red listing, so we are at the moment, we're busy with the red listing process. We will have the results of that, at least for the regional red list next year. But we know that blue swallow is going to be critically endangered. Botha'sLark's critically endangered, and I think we absolutely have to prioritize as per the red list, and then as per the resources that we can pull together and how we are focused in different organizations, trying to collaborate and assist each other rather than all running to do the same work. In terms of the funding competition, I think it's something that's real and that will always be there. We have to raise all the funding ourselves, but it is a case of people's interests that's different, and also mandates that different. So I do think that there's more than enough funding out there, that we just need to get it for all this work.
Staying on the topic of funding, Hanneline, there's a question from Max Pillay, I think, asking an important one, and it's something I alluded to in my little monologue after you finished, but is there any funding coming from provincial or national government for this?
Sadly, at this stage, none, Andrew. So we haven't received any funding from government towards this work. At this stage, I think it's also very recent that we're really talking about the plight of the species, that we've really realized how urgent it is. So hopefully, I really hope that government will come on board and support us. But at this stage, nothing.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. If I manage to get into the environmental portfolio, I'll do my best to channel some funds your way for this kind of thing. Then there's a question here from Eleanor Mary, and anyone who knows the answer can pitch in here. But do we know after which Botha this beautiful lark was named?
I can pitch in, Andrew, if you want.
Sure.
It was named after Louis Botha, who was the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa.
Okay, well, I learned something here today. That's cool. Thank you. Then there's a last couple of questions here. Robin, something around your work and deciding, on limited data, how to prioritize where you do your studies and where you placed your camera traps specifically. Sheena's interested to know. Obviously, it's difficult to find out more information with such a scarce species, and also the clock ticking. So how did you go about prioritizing your study sites?
So in terms of my transect stuff that I did, the transects that I implemented, we started with the distribution modeling. So just, on landscape level, where are they? and then used citizen science data sets to hone in on where are the species to the best of our knowledge, and then use that as a platform to understand and expand outwards. And I think with these rare enigmatic species, it's probably one of the few options you have at your disposal. And so for Botha'sLark, really, and Hanneline way in here, there are only not even a handful of sites left that we could probably target. And so our options, I think, would be to target those areas, but Hanneline, you might be best placed to decide, to comment further on that. But in my mind, it would be starting where the species is known to occur. And when you're dealing with 5% of transects, it really encompasses quite a small area in a big swathe of habitat. So yes, there's a big swathe of grassland, but the areas where we're getting the species is really only constituting a very small portion of that range. And so I think one could use that as a starting point and then work out from there once we gain more insight and understanding in terms of what the species needs and what that means for mapping other comparable areas in the range.
Great. And I'm going to stay with you, Robin. There's a question here from Nigel Collar, just asking for some clarification again around the DHI data that you showed.
Right.
So you showed the importance, I'm just going to read some of it verbatim. You identified the importance of heterogeneous grass structure. Is that the key thing lacking in the low DHI areas? And has it been shown statistically? And then just carrying on, to create heterogeneous grass structure, do you need more than one species of grazer or just a carefully reduced grazing regime? And what would the farmers think of that suggestion?
Very loaded question. Good questions, though, nonetheless. So starting with the first one, the DHI question. The DHI is a remote sensing index, and so it's purely derived from satellite imagery. And really what we were doing there was plotting, observations between DHI values and whether or not the species were utilizing those patches. Is heterogeneous structure the sole contributor to the DHI value itself? I would say no. It's a loaded metric because it's a measure of it's an annual metric. It factors in, both heterogeneous grass structure for sure, but also greenness in terms of rainfall, as you saw how that chart fluctuated based on how productive that particular year was on rainfall. And so I think it captures, as best as I can synthesize, productivity in general. But yes, because we specifically using LIA within the DHI, it's more sensitive to heterogeneous grass structure. And I guess that's the take-home. So maybe the answer is yes, but I think it's a complex metric that speaks to more than one facet of what's on the ground. In terms of the second question, which was how does one, I guess, best obtain heterogeneous grass structure? The three plots that come to mind were the three areas where we had multiple of those endemic species coexisting, which of course I think in my mind is the best case scenario, where we're managing in a way that allows all those endemic species to coexist, which are all threatened. Would be rotational grazing, and two of the sites had pure cattle grazing, and then the third site had a mixture of cattle and sheep. And so they would, not in the same unit, but they'd move, mix the herds around. And one of the sites, the rotational grazing was purely used as a means of, that particular unit was used as an area for calving. Females would calve there and spend some time there with their calves, and then they'd move them off. And so I don't know if I can answer that question, in detail right now, but essentially there are farmers doing it, I guess is the take home that I would like to articulate here, is that farmers are managing in some areas in a commercial way that allows these species to coexist. And so I definitely think there must be some sustainability in that because it's already being done. It's not something novel or new that we're proposing. And so that's a hope for me, in that it is being done in the landscape. We just need to clearly identify the drivers of what yield those particular outputs from grass structure perspective. And then I guess try to see if other farmers might be open to adopting those practices that yield suitable habitat for the species.
Thanks, Robin. Great answer. So there's no more questions in the chat box. There was a comment from Shashi just pointing us towards some research from Belgium around the wind farm issue and painting blades. Thank you, Shashi. Taken note of that, and I'm sure Hanneline has as well. There's also a comment in the chat box from David Weaver down in Harrismith saying that most of their bothas that he'd seen were feeding on the road verges on spilt grain and maize at harvest time, so it should give us some idea of diet, at least a partial part of the diet. And then Dave, I wonder if I can point one last question at you. You mentioned some of the confusion between the calls of the species of the red-capped lark and the Botha'sLark. What about confusion on site identification between pink-billed larks and Botha'sLarks? Any pointers on how to tell those two apart?
Yeah, absolutely. So little anecdotal story there on the red-capped lark to start with, and Robin will giggle because he had exactly the same experience. I've conducted 150 odd point count surveys in November throughout the historical range of Botha'sLark, and was coming up with nothing. Red-capped lark singing about doing their thing, and I'm driving along and I hear Botha'sLark. Pull over, I get excited, I find out who the landowner is, I go running into the veld, spend 30 minutes tracking it down, I'm getting closer. One of the very few times I will use a playback call, play it, it sings back, I play it, it sings back. And there's 3 red-capped larks mimicking the call precisely. I had the conversation with Robin, he had exactly the same. The only difference was he had his kids in the back of the bucky, so they were even less impressed. So that aspect is why we want to pair the camera traps with the audio moths, so we can get a further picture on what the vocalization repertoire was. Please remind me this second. Oh, the pink-billed lark. Okay, so yeah, one of the reasons why we're reasonably confident that we're not overlooking Botha'sLark is because we're picking up pink bills in good number. So the main way to tell the difference is pink bill's got a much stronger, it doesn't always display, but for the most part has a much stronger facial masking. They call it sort of kind of like a clown face. The streaking down the flanks will stop around sort of the scapula, the underarm, for want of a better word, on the pink-billed larks, whereas it will continue down the flanks on the Botha'sLark. And then one of the very best ways to tell is the vent on, so the under the tail on the Botha'sLark will be buffy white, much paler. The pink-billed lark will be a much more richly buff-colored, and the outer tail feathers on the Botha'sLark, particularly if you're lucky enough to see it fly, will be white, whereas on the pink-billed lark, it's a buffy color. Hope that helps.
Awesome, thank you, Dave. And then there was a question from Nandi Mgwatlamba, who asked if there are any other names for the Botha'sLark, and luckily Chris Lotz and Alan Lee have saved me in the chat box, and they've dug up the Zulu and Afrikaans names. So in Afrikaans it's a Val Rivier Leeuwerik, and then in Zulu it's Unon Tilontaka. Okay, so there you go, Nandi. Thanks Chris and Alan for stepping into the breach there while I was trying to manage things. So that's it. That's it from our audience. All that's left to say is thank you everyone for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for the work that you do day in and day out to conserve our birds and their habitats, not just the Botha'sLark, but across our 7 wonderful conservation programs. Thank you to Hanneline and all of our staff for doing it. And it's sometimes not the easiest job. Sometimes you're faced with very dire and emotionally tiring and stressful situations like this Botha'sLark. It does take a toll on us as people because we care so much and we're invested in this, but I think that also gives us motivation to really make a difference. So thank you to everyone who tuned in and lent us your ear. Thank you even more so to those of you who've scanned that QR code. If you haven't and you'd like to donate, please stay on for the post-webinar survey. When you leave, there is an option to drop us your contact details in case you would like to make a donation or get in touch with our team. So please do that if that's what you would like to consider doing. All right. Thank you, Hanneline. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Dave. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. And well, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. The series will carry on, and we've got another endangered species coming up, the African penguin. And we're going to have our team of penguinologists, as well as our pro bono lawyers who are taking the minister to court at the moment over that embattled species. So more from us in 2 weeks' time. Until then, stay safe And yeah, I'll see you online on the other side, not as a host, but as a supporter. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Andrew, for all your wonderful contributions all over the years, and wish you absolutely all the best for your future and much success. And we'll be watching you from the other side.
Thanks, Hanneline. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and good luck.